Hi guys, and welcome back to The Path of Flame by Yodepalma. Chapter 2, In Your Keeping. September 1st dawned bright and early. Maybe a little too early. As Harry ran around the house throwing last-minute items into his trunk, his dad and Ed sat at the kitchen table, blearily staring into their respective mugs of coffee. Harry briefly entertained the thought of taking one of the forbidden alchemy books off the shelf while they weren't paying any attention, but had to dismiss that idea when he realised that Ed would notice, even if his dad didn't. Instead, he quietly took one of the pictures off the mantel, the one with all of Roy's team as well as the Elric brothers in it, and took it into the kitchen. Stopping by his dad's side, he held it up without talking. "Don't you have one of those?" his dad asked, gently taking the picture from him. "Not framed," Harry explained quietly. "I wanted to put it on my nightstand at school." "I could make you a frame," Ed muttered from the other side of the table before yawning widely and staring back into his steaming cup. "We can buy a new one," Roy said back, eyeing Ed's slumped position with narrow eyes. "I don't think you're awake enough to make a toy horse, let alone anything else." "Bastard." Roy grinned at Ed's weak retort, pulling the frame apart and sliding out his picture. Handing the frame to Harry, he said, "Go put this in your trunk and get dressed. We need to leave in a few minutes. Ed, are you actually going to drink your coffee or just stare at it?" "Drinking's too much work," Ed muttered back, but finally took a long sip of his coffee. Just this seemed to perk him up, though Harry knew the caffeine couldn't have kicked in that fast. It had to be that placebo effect thing Al was telling him about the last time he was home. "Fucking hate mornings." Roy hummed vaguely in agreement before knocking back the rest of his mug and giving Harry a pointed look. "You're still here." "Oh, sorry," Harry said, blushing, and scampered off to his room. Behind him he could hear Roy saying something about how absent-minded he was to Ed, and Harry had to make a face at nothing to keep himself from yelling back. He threw the frame his dad had given him into his open trunk, made one last round around his room in search of anything he'd forgotten, then quickly finished getting ready. There was a knock on his door just as he was pulling on his shirt, and Ed walked in before he could yell out for him to wait a second. "What's the point of knocking if you're just going to enter anyway?" "You should be happy you're getting a warning," Ed replied teasingly, and Harry ducked out before Ed could reach to ruffle his hair. The blonde just laughed, before turning his attention to Harry's packed trunk. "You ready to go then?" "I think so," Harry said, kicking his pyjamas closer to the hamper. "I just need to get Hedwig in a cage." "Grab it and let's go before Roy starts nagging, then," Ed said, pulling out his long black wand and tapping lightly at Harry's trunk. Harry grabbed his owl's cage as Ed effortlessly lifted the trunk in one hand and balanced it on his shoulder. They trooped loudly down the stairs where Roy greeted them with a smile and Harry's owl. "We'll have to flew to England in stages," he said as Harry coaxed Hedwig, the snowy owl he'd gotten at Diagon Alley, into her cage. "Should come out at the Ministry of Magic, and then we'll be able to make our way to the train station the Muggle way from there. Assuming we don't get lost, we should make it to the train at least 20 minutes before it leaves." "Remind me to take the featherlight charm off when we get to the Ministry," Ed said as he led his way into the den. "I still don't get why they have to keep themselves hidden from everyone else. It's been hundreds of years since anyone had any real issues with Muggles, isn't it?" "They've had a lot longer than us to learn paranoia," Roy replied thoughtfully. "Not that I condone it. Locking themselves away from Muggles propagates a certain elitist attitude that I find especially irritating when I have to deal with their government." "You're the one that wanted a kid," Ed grinned at Roy over his shoulder as he reached for the flu powder, but Roy just rolled his eyes and gestured for Ed to get moving. In the end, they made it to the station with barely 15 minutes to spare, and they found themselves pushing almost frantically through the crowds at the station. They were grateful when they reached the barrier between the platforms 9 and 10 and didn't see anyone looking as they prepared to use it. Harry eyed it a little uncertainly, though. It looked awfully solid. "Go through with me?" he asked nervously, giving both his dad and Ed a beseeching look. "There's unlikely to be any trouble on the platform," Roy murmured to Ed, who was scowling back at Roy, "and you'll only be a few steps behind us." Ed sighed, but seemed to agree with Roy as he took a step back and began glaring around the station suspiciously. Roy smiled fondly at Ed, then put a hand on the trolley they'd found so Harry could push his things. "Don't be nervous, Harry. It's the same thing as the hidden passages at headquarters. Harry nodded seriously and adjusted his grip on the handles. He was too embarrassed to explain to Roy that just having his dad beside him made walking into a wall significantly less daunting. So he didn't say anything as they briskly walked towards the barrier. He held his breath as they approached it, strongly resisting the urge to close his eyes, and only let it out again once they were on the other side, looking at the bright red train. Roy ran a soothing hand over Harry's head as they stepped aside to wait for Ed to come through. "Potter!" a voice called as they waited, and Harry turned automatically in its direction. He felt himself blush as he noticed that quite a few people in the vicinity had turned to look in the direction of the voice as well, and were now looking at him with an intense interest. Draco Malfoy was striding towards them with a smug-looking smirk on his face, two larger boys following a few steps behind him. "Did you have to call me out like that?" Harry asked with a frown as he saw Ed coming through the archway. Ed was still glaring around the platform, but he made his way unerringly towards them as he did so. "Now everyone's looking at me." "Sorry," Draco drawled, but he was still smirking, so Harry figured he wasn't actually sorry at all. "I don't know how else I was supposed to get your attention, though." "I have a first name," Harry hissed, looking up at his dad as Roy snorted. The man was clearly hiding a smile behind his hand, and Harry grimaced at him in an attempt to relay that he wanted help. "It's lovely to see you again, Mr. Malfoy," Roy said obligingly, lowering his hand to shake Draco's. "And who are your friends, then?" "Oh, this is Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle," Draco introduced casually, waving at each of the boys as he said their names. "We've room left in our compartment if you'd like to join us." "Harry!" When Harry rolled his eyes again, he heard Ed laugh and saw his dad's smile twitch wider. He had no idea why the two of them found this so amusing. He just thought Draco was a prat. Still, it would be nice to sit with someone he'd already met for the long train ride, so he nodded agreeably. Draco's smirk widened into a grin briefly, before the boy seemed to tamp it down, and then he led them all over to the train. The compartment he showed them had two other people inside waiting for them, a small pug-faced girl and a thin black boy. Predictably, both of them looked up at Harry's bangs when he entered with Hedwig's cage in hand. The girl's surprise was tangible, but the boy just snorted and looked up at Harry through narrow eyes. "Guess you weren't exaggerating, then," he said in a disaffected voice, nodding at Harry personably. "Good to meet you, Potter. I'm Blaise Zabini, and that's Pansy Parkinson." "It's nice to meet you both," Harry responded awkwardly, bowing automatically. "Get out the doorway, kid, would ya?" Ed asked from behind him, giving Harry a hard poke in the back. "Your trunk's damn heavy." "Sorry, Ed," Harry replied, jumping to the side quickly. Ed strolled into the room, nodded vaguely at the kids, and slid the trunk in question under the table with a grunt. This is Edward Elric, my dad's boyfriend," he introduced Ed a little awkwardly, then turned slightly to where he was unsurprised to find his dad leaning against the doorway. "And this is my foster dad, Brigadier General Roy Mustang, the Flame Alchemist. Please don't ever make me say that whole thing again." "Lazy," Roy chided gently, kneeling down and tugging Harry toward him. Harry sighed and stared at the far wall as his dad fixed his collar and rubbed lightly at his shoulders. "I know I'm embarrassing, but you'll get over it." He grinned at Harry's snort, then reached up to fluff his hair affectionately. "Dad!" Harry couldn't help but whine, squirming out of his reach. Roy just laughed at him. Sometimes his dad was such a jerk. "I don't get why anyone thinks you have any fucking dignity," Ed said companionably to Roy. He reached out a hand to Harry's head as well, but thankfully seemed content to just pat the hair down, rather than make it any messier. "You're a complete dork. It's not even cute." "Well, at least I'll always have you to keep my ego in check," Roy sighed, shooting Ed a brief glare. "Am I even going to get a hug before you go?" he asked Harry. "Are you going to mess with my hair again?" Harry asked warily, suspiciously eyeing Roy's responding grin, and sighed before he stepped forward. Roy wrapped his arms around Harry firmly, and Harry couldn't resist the urge to lean into the embrace and bury his face into his father's shoulder. "Owl me in a week and let me know how you're settling in," Roy said softly, rubbing at his back in soothing circles. "If you're not comfortable, I can take you out and let you learn somewhere close to home, okay?" But, as much as Harry wished he could go to school somewhere close enough for his dad to at least visit, he didn't want to go to Central. It was, to put it the nicest way possible, just not a fun place to be anymore. Harry had never been popular at his schools in Central, but after the last Fuhrer had died, the friends he had seemed suddenly less interested in talking to him. From what Harry had gathered, the rumour going around the upper brass was that his dad had been the one to kill Bradley, and so they told their children not to associate with Roy Mustang's son any longer. And when the popular general's children had started to snub Harry, many of the other students had started to follow their lead. Overall, he was glad he was going to school in a different country, where he could start anew. "I'll be fine," Harry assured his dad, though the cloth of Roy's uniform muffled his voice. He pulled away after that and rubbed his eyes that definitely weren't wet at all. "Do you think Aunt Gracia would let you send me a pie? I think I'm going to miss her cooking the most." "Man after my own heart," Ed said teasingly, and Harry grinned up at him. Then, following a sudden urge, he pulled away from his dad and moved to wrap his arms around Ed's waist. The blonde man stiffened. Harry wasn't sure he'd actually ever hugged Ed before, but after a tense moment, he gently wrapped his arms around Harry's shoulder. "Is this your way of saying you're going to miss me?" "Why in the world would I miss you?" Harry asked, pulling away. He flushed at the fond smile his dad was giving them both, and quickly said, "Shouldn't you two be getting off the train? I bet it's going to leave soon." "Trying to get rid of us, I see," Roy said softly. He pulled Harry into another brief hug, kissing the top of his head and ignoring Harry's aggravated whine as he stood up. "If you need anything at all, let me know immediately, and I'll get it to you, okay? I love you." "I love you too, Dad," Harry mumbled, not looking him in the eye. "See you, Ed." He looked up when Roy patted his head one last time, and smiled a little when his dad wrapped an arm around Ed's waist as they left the compartment. At least Roy had someone at home to distract him when he inevitably started sulking at Harry's absence. When he turned around to settle into whatever seat was left for him, predictably next to Draco, he was met with 3 nearly identical mocking smirks. "What?" he snarled defensively as he threw himself onto the bench, glaring. "Figures you'd be so attached to someone who's not even related to you," Draco replied mockingly. "Is he Muggle-born? Why is he in the military?" "I don't think he is," Harry said uncertainly. "I think his aunt's a squib, maybe. I don't know, it's not really that important in Amestris. And how should I know why he's in the military? He never talks about it." "What's the deal with the other guy?" Blaze asked, more curiously than meanly. "He looked a lot younger than your dad did, and seemed rather uncouth," Harry suggested with a grin. "That's what Dad calls him all the time." When Blaze nodded, Harry shrugged back and continued. "Ed's, he's Ed. He's kind of hard to describe. At least without going into his military service, which Harry wasn't even sure he was allowed to talk about. He teaches alchemy and physics at the Central University. He's kind of like a second dad, I guess. He's been staying with us for like 3 years." "Older than he looks," Blaze pushed, raising an eyebrow as Harry grimaced at him. "Not really," he mumbled, not wanting to get into his dad's and Ed's age difference. "He'll be 20 soon, but he's really mature, I guess. Dad really likes him anyway. They're kind of gross about it, actually." "And what's his parentage?" Draco asked snidely. Harry stared at him with wide eyes, feeling uncomfortable at the question. What did it matter? Were wizards outside of Amestris really this petty? "I don't know," Harry said flatly, crossing his arms defensively. "He doesn't talk about his parents, and Dad told me not to ask him. Why do you think it even matters? Ed's a really powerful wizard and alchemist. He's kind of a big deal back home. Youngest person to ever get tenured at Central, which is the best college in the nation." Draco shared a look with Blaze and Pansy, then turned back to Harry again and asked, "Is it true that Amestrian wizards don't isolate themselves from Muggles? I didn't think it could be. The Muggles must be awful to you." "No," Harry said uncertainly, looking around at everyone in the compartment, utterly baffled. "Why would they be? The worst that happens is people go crazy over alchemists, because they can actually use alchemized products, unlike the magic ones. But it's not a big deal. Some of Dad's team are muggles, and at least one squib, and they're some of the scariest people I know. Well, Hawkeye was anyway. He loved the woman like an aunt, but anyone that could glare his dad into listening to them terrified him. You're joking, Pansy sneered. Her expression echoed on the others' faces. Your wizards can't be very good then, can they? Harry scowled at her, but couldn't really think of any response. He was just realising that these kids had probably never even seen a muggle before, let alone interacted with one, and must have been some of the wizarding elites that his dad had been talking about earlier in the day. Blindly insisting that muggles weren't inherently inferior to wizards wasn't going to work, and obviously he couldn't just present Hawkeye to them as proof. So what would his dad say? Maybe you guys could come out to Amestris one day, he said, voice shaking a little with his anger. You could probably learn a lot from our wizards, especially about what muggles are actually like. The majority of the military is composed of muggles, you know, and my dad says that we have one of the most feared militaries in the world. Of course, he wasn't going to tell them that that was mostly due to the fear most people felt when facing a group of Amestrian alchemists. It's not easy to visit Amestris, Blaze said. My mom's been trying for years, but apparently if you don't have someone in the military speaking for you, they usually deny you entry, even for vacations. Well, now you know someone in the military, don't you? Harry said brightly. And Dad's a pretty distinct figure, so I bet he wouldn't have any trouble gaining your family's entrance if I asked him to. So you can teach us the error of our ways? Draco asked snidely, with the air of someone quoting a person that they didn't like. Harry made himself smile at him. So you can experience muggles in a new environment and make your own conclusion based on the information you gain, Harry answered smoothly, because that's what his dad would have said. Thankfully, this seemed to be the conclusion of this conversation, at least for the time being. The others fell into a conversation about Quidditch instead. Harry didn't even pretend to follow it, as he'd never really taken an interest in any international sports. Instead, he stared out the window past the others, watching as the countryside flicked by. It was very like the more rural areas of Amestris, all green grass and farm animals grazing in the fields. And he was just getting bored of the scenery when a woman with a cart full of junk food slid their compartment door open to ask if they wanted anything. Harry, who'd never really got as much candy as he'd have liked, in the more recent years because Ed tended to hoard it all, jumped from his seat with some excitement. Of course, like everything else in Wizarding England, the sight he was met with was completely new and in many ways completely absurd. He was just finishing reading the label on the chocolate frog packet when Draco appeared at his side and lightly elbowed him out of the way. What, haven't you ever seen candy before? Well, it's completely different from the candy in Amestris, isn't it? Harry asked shortly, tossing a frog up and down in one hand as Draco took his time choosing his own snacks. Do they really enchant these things to hop? Well, of course they do, Draco replied, giving Harry a confused look. Don't you have enchanted candy at Amestris? Only in specialist shops, and they tend to be a lot more expensive than regular candy. Harry frowned at the frog in his hand, wondering whether he felt like spending the money on it. Muggles aren't really supposed to consume enchanted food. It makes them sick, so the stuff that caters specifically for magical people has to be separated from everything else and has all sorts of warning labels on it. Prevents lawsuits and emergency room visits. That's so weird, Draco muttered, handing some money to the witch. We don't have muggle candy here, so if you want chocolate, you better get some frogs, and the every flavour beans are always fun. But don't bother with the cauldron cakes. A lot of witches make them better at home. Oh, thanks, Harry said, surprised that Draco had decided to be helpful instead of making fun of Amestris for catering to muggles or something. With Draco's suggestions in mind, he bought a couple of pumpkin pasties, a bag of every flavour beans, and a handful of chocolate frogs to take back to the compartment with him. The others stared at him as he dropped his haul on the seat next to him, but he ignored them in favour of opening a pasty while he inspected the bag of beans. Why don't they have flavours on them? When they say every flavour, they really mean every flavour, Blaze said warningly. leaning over to gesture for Harry to give him the bag. Harry handed it over without hesitation, watching as he carefully opened the bag and peered inside. Eventually he pulled out a red bean and wordlessly handed the bag over to Draco. With a smirk, Draco took out 2 beans without looking, which he tossed one at a time to the silent Crab and Goyle, before carefully choosing another 2 for himself and Pansy. When Harry was handed the bag again, everyone stared at him until he sighed and pulled a bean out for himself. "Anyone want to make a guess?" Pansy asked, inspecting the bean in her hand. "This one looks like the grass-flavoured one I had a few weeks ago." "Mine's either cherry or blood," Blaze said with confidence. "I'm kind of interested to find out which." "Freak," Draco muttered, though he only received a smirk for the insult. He held up his own dark bean to the light, wrinkling his nose as he squinted at it. "I don't really know. It looks safe enough. It's similar to the colour of the blackberries that Mother purchased." The 3 of them turned expectantly to Harry. Apparently, Crab and Goyle weren't expected to make intelligent guesses. Harry frowned at them, then looked down at the weird yellow bean in his hand. "I really hope it's lemon-flavoured," he said doubtfully. "Only I can't think of anything else naturally this colour." "Some tomatoes and peppers," Pansy suggested helpfully. "Maybe a kiwi," Blaze said. "Mum brought home some yellow kiwi the other day. I don't even like regular kiwi." "Well, we'll find out in a second." Draco smirked, then turned to Harry. "On 3. Everyone has to eat the whole bean. Anyone who spits it out has to try another one. Everyone ready?" As everyone nodded, he began to count, and when he said 3 with some gusto, everyone popped the candy into their mouths. Harry could feel his face contorting almost immediately. His was definitely lemon, and a particularly sour one at that. Still, he couldn't have gotten the worst bean of the lot. While Draco, Blaze and Goyle were chewing relatively peacefully, Pansy had a look of abject disgust on her face, and Crab looked like he was going to throw up, though he'd never spit it out. "It's cabbage," Pansy said with disgust. "I hate cabbage." "Dunno what this is," Crab said in a low voice before swallowing painfully, "but it tasted awful. I hate this game." "Mushroom," Goyle announced shortly, and didn't say anything else. "Well, it's not blackberry, but it's some sort of fruit," Draco announced thoughtfully. "It's not bad, really." "Blaze?" "Blood," Blaze said in a perfectly pleasant tone. "Definitely blood. And I don't think we even need you to tell us what you got, Potter. Your face is hilarious." "Thanks," Harry said sourly. They played the game for a few more times as the train continued on, seemingly endlessly, holding conversations in between rounds. Harry ended up learning a lot more about the wizarding culture than he had expected to, particularly about Hogwarts. Apparently the student body was separated into 4 houses, each characterised by different personality traits. Everyone else in the compartment already seemed certain that they were going to get into the Slytherin house, mostly due to coming from long lines of former Slytherins. They also pressed him for an opinion on which house he might belong in, but after hearing what each house was known for, he honestly didn't really have much of one. When the train finally began to slow down, Harry reluctantly switched his long jacket out for a set of robes. He was the only one that had to do so, the others probably having changed into their robes before Harry had even gotten to this train station. And Harry had just sat down again when a voice announced that they would be at the castle in 5 minutes. They exited onto the platform, shivering at the cold night air, and looking uncertainly around at their surroundings. Harry was the first one to notice the lantern that was bobbing over their heads. "First years!" a loud voice called over the milling crowd. "First years, over here!" The man calling for them was the biggest person Harry had ever seen. It looked like someone had combined Armstrong and Sig into a small giant, Harry thought. But when the first years finally approached him, Harry could see that the man's eyes were crinkled with a kind smile. "That must be Hagrid," Draco whispered to him, crowding his elbow. "He's the gamekeeper. I hear he's something of a savage. Can't even do magic." "He looks nice," Harry muttered back, frowning again. Draco probably had some sort of response to that, but at that moment they found themselves at the bank of a large lake. Across the lake, perched on a mountain top, they could see Hogwarts sparkling against the starry sky. Draco pulled Harry into a boat with him when Hagrid directed them to, Crabbe and Goyle following at their heels like bodyguards, and the fleet of boats glided through the still water to what seemed to be an underground harbour beneath the castle. Hagrid led the way up a flight of stairs, knocking on the door, then handed them off to a stern-looking witch he called Professor McGonagall. The professor greeted them with a speech detailing the house system, which Harry only half paid attention to, and then she disappeared into the hall. The first years huddled together silently, everyone looking anxious, except for one brown-haired girl who was whispering excitedly about the magic that she'd already learnt. The near silence ended abruptly when several people at the back of the group screamed. Harry spun around and almost fell into one of the fighting stances that Ed had showed him, before he realised that the white stream that had appeared in the chamber was actually coming from a group of ghosts. He could see Draco eyeing him curiously out of the corner of his eye, but he ignored the pale boy to watch the ghosts instead. They were arguing passionately with each other, and only stopped when one of the ghosts finally seemed to notice the terrified children. This one spun in the air towards them to smile kindly and start a short, one-sided conversation. "Move along now," a sharp voice interrupted a Hufflepuff ghost dressed like a friar. "The sorting ceremony's about to start." When the ghosts disappeared through the far wall, Professor McGonagall had the students form a line so that they could neatly follow her out into the great hall. Harry twisted his head as much as he could to take it in. The golden plates and goblets on the tables glowed softly in the candlelight, and when Harry looked up, he noticed that the ceiling looked exactly like the starry sky outside. Everyone stared as McGonagall brought out a stool and a dilapidated-looking hat, placing it in front of the first years. A tear near the brim opened wide, and the hat sang rather pleasantly about the Hogwarts houses and what each of them represented. Amid the applause that broke out in its conclusion, McGonagall stepped up next to the hat and unrolled a long parchment. "When I call your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool to be sorted," she told them shortly. Harry tried not to twitch nervously as she called out the names alphabetically, and the group of students he was standing with slowly dwindled, until finally only Blaise the Beanie stood beside him, looking bored. Each of the others had gotten into Slytherin, as they'd predicted. "Potter, Harry," she finally called, and whispers immediately hissed out through the hall, repeating his name in disbelief. He only had a second to see most of the hall shifting to get a good look at him, and a frown tugged at his lips before the sorting hat fell neatly over his eyes. Not really sure what to expect, he tapped the edge of his stool nervously as he waited for something to happen. A tiny voice said. "Difficult. Very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind, either. There's talent. Oh, my goodness. Yes. And a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting. So, where shall I put you?" Harry shrugged, not really having an opinion. Then, figuring that the hat probably couldn't see what he was doing, thought, "Wherever you think's best, I guess." "Well, then, there's no doubt which house will lead you to greatness. You know? Still no opinion? Then I best put you in Slytherin!" The Slytherin table broke into a raucous applause, and when Harry walked over to it, Draco pulled him into a seat before anyone else could get a hold of him. Students up and down the table were leaning around each other to get a good look at him, and some of the students around him reached over to shake his hand enthusiastically. "Good show, Potter," Draco whispered to him, clapping a hand on his shoulder in a friendly manner. "I knew you had it in you." "Thanks," Harry whispered back uncertainly, looking around the hall with some confusion. Students at the other 3 tables were looking over at him, some with open hostility on their faces, and even Professor McGonagall seemed to have stopped calling out students' names as she stared over to him in shock. Harry didn't understand what the problem was. Surely cunning and ambition weren't bad traits to have. So he straightened his shoulders and rearranged his expression into something less bewildered. Folding his hands neatly on the table, he leaned slightly in Draco's direction and asked, "What's their problem now?" "Oh, everyone hates Slytherins," Draco replied with a smirk Harry could barely see in his peripheral vision. "Dad says they think we're all dishonest dark wizards in training, and none of it's helped by Salazar Slytherin's own belief in the superiority of purebloods." "We're fucking 11, Harry snapped, the curse slipping out with his anger. "Thanks, Ed. My dad won't even let me learn alchemy yet, and they're expecting me to learn dark magic." Draco snickered, but at that moment McGonagall cleared her throat and continued with the sorting. When Blaise was finally sorted and had seated himself across from Harry, the hall slowly fell silent as McGonagall took the sorting hat and stool from the great hall. An old man with a ridiculously long beard stood from his seat at the staff table, beaming at the students with too much cheer.
"Welcome," he said. "Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts. Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words. And here they are. Nitwit, blubber, ointment, tweak. Thank you."
He sat back down to scattered laughter and applause, and when Harry looked down, he saw that food was already weighing the table down. Putting the rest of the students out of his mind, Harry helped himself to as much food as he could fit onto his plate and fell into a pleasant conversation with the rest of his peers. At least these Slytherins, whatever else might be said about them, didn't seem to be automatically assuming that he was going to turn dark. So that was it for Chapter 3 of The Path of Flame. I am so sorry for my terrible pronunciation of Blaise's surname and for the god-awful Scottish accent for McGonagall. I will try and get that Scottish accent a little bit better, but I'm making no promises. So thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for Chapter 4.